Golden dawn broke over the beautiful coast of Charleston. But for Helen, it was the moment everything collapsed. At 70, she had nowhere to go. Her own son and daughter-in-law had thrown her out of the house her late husband built with his hands. They took everything, leaving her with nothing but an old suitcase and the echo of a locked door. But there was one thing they didn't know about the quiet woman standing on that porch. Helen was not the kind of victim who breaks easily. She had once been a chief ER nurse, used to fighting for life amid the cold hum of operating rooms. And this time, the life she had to save was her own. This is a true story about the bottomless greed of family, about betrayal that cuts deeper than any wound, and about the fierce rebirth of a mother who refused to disappear. Helen won't seek revenge with anger or violence. She will fight back with intellect, truth, and the unyielding light of justice she's carried within her for 70 years. Before we begin this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. My name is Helen Turner. I'm 70 years old. And what I'm about to tell you today will forever change the way you see your own family. The sea has always been the clock of my life. It taught me when to wake, when to rest, when to think, and when to let go. After living long enough by the shores of Charleston, I began to believe the sea understood me. Its rhythm like a heartbeat, steady, forgiving, and patient. That morning was no different. The sky was a gentle blue, the water reflecting the light like a mirror. The wind carried the scent of salt and memories. That smell my husband once called the fragrance of peaceful souls. I drove the old Buick into the yard, right beside the magnolia tree that had stood there for over 40 years. The gravel crunching beneath the tires sounded strangely familiar, a sound that reminded me something still hadn't changed. I pushed the wooden gate open. The hinges creaked, just as they always did. I never fixed them. I liked that sound. It felt like the house saying hello. My garden was just the same. Climbing roses wrapped around the fence, green vines clinging to the wooden trellis my husband built right after his heart surgery. I still remember it, how he grumbled about the price of nails going up, but smiled anyway. I took off my wide-brimmed hat, letting the sunlight warm my face. For a fleeting second, it felt like stepping back in time, when everything was still whole. Then came the sound, a strange, piercing noise that shattered the calm. At first, it was just music, distant but growing louder, thudding against my chest. Heavy bass, laughter, and shouting mixed together. A woman's voice. I recognized it instantly. Melissa. I froze on the path, my palms turning cold. No way. It had to be the neighbors throwing a party, I thought. But no, the sound was too clear. It was coming from my house. I hurried up the porch steps. The screen door was wide open, held in place by a shoe. Not how I left it. Inside, the air was thick with cheap perfume, fried food, and alcohol. I took a breath, steadying myself, and stepped in. The living room looked like a nightmare. Nothing was in its place anymore. The white lace curtains were gone, replaced by warped plastic ones. The oak table had been shoved against the wall, covered with beer cans, papers, and leftovers. Clothes were strewn over the chairs. The TV blared a loud reality show. I took slow steps, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. In the framed mirror on the wall, I caught my reflection, and behind me, the wedding photo. My husband was smiling, his eyes as kind as ever. And there I stood, stunned, powerless, in a house I no longer recognized. Then came a sharp crack, brittle, breaking, and loud. I turned. White porcelain shards scattered across the floor. the seagull statue my husband had sculpted during his last winter. Melissa's little boy stood frozen, eyes wide, a plastic ball still clutched in his hand. I didn't mean to, he stammered. Before I could speak, Melissa appeared, her steps heavy, wrapped in a loud, floral robe, a glass of wine in hand, though it was barely morning. "Oh, for God's sake, it's just a stupid bird statue," she snapped, then saw me. Her expression shifted, cold, mocking. "What are you doing here?" I stood still. "This is my house." She gave a derisive laugh. "David said we could stay here, just for a while, until things settle down." I echoed softly, trembling. "Settle down?" "Yeah, we need a place to stay. And this house was empty, so what's the big deal?" I tried to keep the anger from breaking through. "You didn't ask me." Melissa shrugged, leaning closer, her tone dripping with challenge. "Didn't think I needed your permission. I thought you were just visiting." Before I could react, she stepped up and grabbed my wrist. "Listen, Helen," she said, her voice low but sharp as glass. "You've had your time. Now it's ours. Don't make things harder than they have to be." I looked at her hand gripping mine, then met her eyes. There was no trace of respect there anymore. Then she shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why is this old woman here? This is our house." The room went silent for a moment. The music still thumped faintly in the background, but all I heard was my heartbeat and the weight of broken memories. The wedding photo slipped off the wall. I bent to pick it up. A long crack ran across my husband's smile. I brushed off the dust and straightened the frame. "You wouldn't believe this, would you, dear?" I whispered. Melissa was still talking, her voice dull and tangled like wind leaking through a doorframe. I couldn't hear her anymore. All that remained was the sound of waves, distant but near, reminding me to breathe. Then I heard the door open. A familiar, shaky voice. "Mom?" I turned. David stood in the doorway, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding mine. My only son, the boy who once brought me seashells after every storm, now looked like a stranger. "You let them stay here?" I asked quietly, almost pleading for a denial. He didn't meet my eyes. "Mom? I just said they could stay for a while. Everything will be fine." "Stay for a while?" I repeated. "In my house?" David sighed, eyes fixed on the floor. "You have the guest house. I thought you could stay there, just for a bit, I promise." I looked at him. My eyes burned. Not from anger, but from the hollow ache inside. He didn't understand. He truly didn't understand what he'd just done. I held the wedding frame tightly, my voice rough. "You just gave away what your father spent his life protecting. You didn't lend them a house, David. You gave them everything that was mine." He stayed silent. Melissa said something from the other room, laughing derisively. I didn't catch the words. I only felt my heart slow, heavy, sinking. I placed the frame back on the table carefully. "Your father used to say, if one day you lose everything, this house will still be your refuge." But now, I had no refuge left. I walked out, my hands trembling but my back straight. No one said a word. I heard Melissa laugh behind me, then David's tired, low voice. Outside, the sea wind swept through my hair, carrying the salt and chill. I looked at the house one last time. Through the window, I saw my son standing there, silent. Melissa still talking, waving her arms, and he just nodded. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I'd grown used to losing what I loved. I opened the car door, started the engine. The sea was still there, calm, indifferent, as if it had never heard anyone cry. In the rearview mirror, I saw an old woman with silver hair and red eyes, but a fire still burning inside them. They thought I was just an old lady, but they forgot. I was born in a storm, and this time, I will take back what's mine. I drove away from the house as if escaping a fever. The road along Charleston stretched between salt and humid sunlight, the tires crunching over the old gravel. I didn't stop at a motel as I'd planned. My hands turned the wheel on their own toward the harbor where my youth once lived. Seabreeze Inn appeared behind a line of oak trees draped in moss, its weathered wooden sign still swaying in the wind like a memory refusing to fade. The wind chime jingled softly when I pushed the door open. Margaret looked up from her knitting, her eyes bright as ever. "Helen, it's been a long time. I'm still here, still breathing, and I need a quiet place. Second floor's got a room facing the harbor. Old, but it's got good wind and deep sleep. Stay as long as you like." The room was narrow, the wooden floor cracked and clicking. The window opened straight onto the cluster of wooden boats rocking on the water. The clinking of the ropes against the posts sounded like the sea's clock ticking. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. Inside me was only an emptiness, deep, cold, and calm, like the winter sea. I called Evelyn. She answered on the second ring, her voice low, warm, and steady. "Eve, it's me. You sound tired, Helen. What happened?" "My son let someone else live in my house, and they treated me like a stranger." We didn't talk long. When I mentioned the broken seagull statue, there was a pause on her end. Then she said, "You're too kind. That's why you're their target. Don't let them take anything else, Helen." I hung up and leaned my head against the wall. The sound of waves hitting the dock came through. The smell of salt pulled me back to the days when we first started saving. Back then, I worked night shifts as a nurse. He was a carpenter. Every week, he'd tuck $50 into a tin box. One more nail for our future roof. When we'd saved enough, we bought a small piece of land near the sea. Small, with yellow sand and sharp wind, but to us, it was a promise. 3 years later, wall by wall, the house rose, every shingle set with care. The night it was finished, he sat on the porch sipping tea. "This house isn't rich," he said, "but it's real. It breathes with us." I believed that all my life. I unlocked my phone almost unconsciously. Melissa's account popped up first. Amelia C. Life. The picture hit me like a wave. Her legs crossed on the armchair my husband had carved by hand, a glass of wine in her hand, the sea view window behind her. The caption glittered beneath. "Just signed the papers. A new life in South Carolina begins." Signed. Papers? I tapped the comments. Friends congratulated her on owning a seaside house. The word owning stuck in my throat like a thorn. They weren't just staying temporarily. They were moving to make it legal, to steal my refuge. I set the phone down and stood by the window. The sky hung low and heavy. The air smelled of fish, oil, and salt. Down at the dock, fishermen hauled in their nets, water glinting. The honest shine of hard work. I used to believe that labor and kindness could ward off injustice. Today, that belief cracked, not shattered, but fractured deep. I pulled a chair to the desk and took out my old notebook. The yellowed pages were filled with neat records, the footprints of a life spent carefully. On the last page, the modest numbers lay quiet, as if they knew their place. I closed the book and pressed my palm against it. Dignity doesn't live in numbers. Dignity lives in how we rise again. In my mind, I heard his voice. When you face injustice, don't shout. Step back, observe, then strike at the right time. I smiled faintly. He always stepped back before hammering a stubborn nail, letting the hammer find its perfect fall. I had forgotten that habit. The wind shifted, carrying a mist of rain. Margaret knocked gently and handed me a teapot. It's cold tonight. Peppermint tea to keep you warm. The sea still smells the same. The sea doesn't change much. People do. I cradled the pot, inhaling the faint scent of dried leaves. Suddenly, I longed for the sound of his saw on the porch, the crackle of the old radio, and his half-joking line, "Take a break, love." Back then, every time his hands stopped working, I feared the house itself would sag. Now, I am the one who must hold it upright. I picked up the phone again and opened Melissa's photo. In the corner of the frame, my wedding photo peeked out, pushed aside like unwanted clutter. I zoomed in. The glass was scratched. My throat burned. In the caption, she had added a comment. "Finally done with the paperwork. No more worries." What paperwork? A quitclaim deed? Power of attorney? Some fabricated form based on a vague medical diagnosis to strip me of rights? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. A text from Evelyn appeared. "If you need, I know someone at the county senior rights council. Call me." I replied, "Thank you. Tomorrow I'll go back to the house." She sent one more line. "Go straight in. Look carefully. Stay calm. Don't sign anything. Don't talk much. Take photos of everything." I turned off the screen and listened to the rain tapping on the metal roof. I remembered my nights in the ER. People thought I was fragile, but once the shift began, my hands never trembled. I couldn't afford to shake. Every decision was a line between life and loss. Today was no different, except the patient was my own life. I stood up and opened the old wardrobe, pulling out my thick coat. The habit returned, preparing for a shift. Notebook, pen, fully charged phone, tissues, water bottle, and the copies of my old house deeds, kept safe in a plastic sleeve. I placed them neatly in a canvas bag. People call it self-defense. To me, it was a ritual before a storm. Outside, the harbor lights flickered along the water, each one a tiny whisper of "hold on." I pressed my forehead to the cold window pane, letting the chill sharpen my thoughts. I thought of David, the boy who once brought me seashells after storms, asking, "Isn't this one pretty, Mom?" I didn't know what he owed, what he feared, or what promises trapped him. Only that he had handed my peace to someone else. I would have to face him, but not with tears, with truth. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Don't argue, don't sign, photograph everything, retrieve documents and keepsakes, find a lawyer if forgery is suspected." I closed the notebook and exhaled slowly. The peppermint tea had gone cold, blending with the smell of damp wood and sea salt. The poor little room suddenly felt warm, not from the lamp, but from the small flame of resolve I had just relit. Night fell. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the waves and creaking ropes lull me. In that drowsy space before sleep, I saw myself standing before the house, hand on the old lock, head held high. Not a mother begging for a place, a keeper returned. Before I drifted off, I wrote one final line in the notebook. Tomorrow, I will go back, not to plead, but to look them in the eye and begin to take back what's mine. Tomorrow, the sea will still be blue as ever. But I will no longer be the gentle Helen of yesterday. I am the woman who built a home with sweat and salt water. And if I must, I will build it again with my own hands. I returned the next morning, when dew still clung to the roadside grass. The sea was quieter than usual. The sky drooped, as if it knew what I was about to witness. In my bag, I had my phone, a small notebook, and the old key I had always kept. The strap was worn, but the key still shone. I never replaced it. As if the lock still recognized the key, that house was still mine. I parked the car a few meters from the gate, not wanting them to hear the engine. The road was empty, only seagulls crying overhead and the wind rustling through the brush. From a distance, the house appeared, with its familiar stance, but no longer a home. Several window frames were flung wide open, curtains flapping, loud pop music booming out like a declaration of invasion. I drew a deep breath and stepped onto the stone path where my husband once carved our initials under the cement, H&R, 1984. Moss covered it now, but I could still see it. Each step felt like treading on the past. I opened the door. No one heard. The smell of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke mixed with a familiar damp wood scent and made me dizzy. Inside, the living room was even messier than before. On the table, wine glasses, beer cans, papers, shoes, coats. Such chaos the house itself seemed to be panting. I walked slowly, keeping my shoes from making a sound. I knew exactly which floorboards creaked, which stair steps were loose. When I was a nurse, I learned how to move fast, without noise. Now that skill returned, letting me pass like a ghost through my own roof. I went straight upstairs. The small metal safe was in the bedroom where I kept important papers and a few of my husband's old letters. But when I got there, my heart sank. The safe door was wide open. The lock had been twisted out of shape. Papers were scattered across the floor. I crouched down, hands trembling as I gathered them sheet by sheet. The house deed, the insurance policy, bank booklets, and the letters he wrote to me after his first surgery, all ransacked as if someone was searching for something specific. Then I heard a voice from the next room. Melissa's, low but clear. "Keep looking. She can't prove anything without that medical record. Got it?" I froze. My heart felt like a squeezed fist. Medical record? Why that? I stepped back and leaned against the wall. My eyes fell on the wristwatch, my husband's, set on the vanity. The silver face gleamed, the old leather strap worn thin. But what left me stunned was, it wasn't just set there. Another hand had just lifted it to wear. Veronica, Melissa's sister, stood at the mirror, smirking. The watch gleamed on her wrist, its silver reflecting her fake smile. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Helen," she said, voice lilting. "I didn't know you were dropping by. Melissa's out, and David's signing papers at the office. I think you should call first." I swallowed, keeping my voice steady. "That watch belongs to my husband?" She arched an eyebrow and smoothed her hair. "Oh, I thought it was Melissa's. She said David gave it to her." "Gave it?" I repeated, each word scraping down my sore throat. "It's not a trinket." Veronica shrugged, still wearing the watch, turning back to the mirror. "Everything changes, Helen. Accept it. You should rest. Your health isn't so good anymore." That sentence, light as air, but piercing like a needle. Health not good, I understood. They were building a narrative. An old, confused woman, no longer competent to keep her property. A medical diagnosis that could turn ownership into a joke. I went quiet for a few seconds, then said softly, "I only came to get a few things." "Help yourself," Veronica said, and walked out, leaving behind a suffocating trail of heavy perfume. I waited a few minutes, listening to her heels fade down the hall. Then I moved to the corner of the room where a small wooden box sat. It held the letters my husband wrote in his final years. Shaky strokes, smudged ink, but warm. "If you're reading this, it means I'm at peace. Don't be afraid to be alone. This house will protect you." I hugged the box to my chest, my hands trembling. But this time, not from fear. It was because I felt something changing inside me. Fear had given way to resolve. I gathered the papers that remained and photographed them with my phone. Each page, every corner. Utility bills, bank letters, a transfer contract. In that mess, I found a copy of a quitclaim deed. A deed transferring ownership. The signature on it was none other than David's. Beside it, a document headed from the private clinic Charleston Health Associates. In bold letters, diagnosis, early cognitive decline. Below, a doctor's signature I had never seen. The date was exactly 4 weeks ago. I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. I snapped photos quickly, heart hammering. Sweat soaked my collar. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. I could almost hear my pulse louder than the waves outside. Then, a noise. The garage door opened. I darted into the wardrobe and pulled it shut, my heart about to explode. Light leaked through the crack. Footsteps. Then Melissa's voice, hoarse with fatigue. "God, those people in Atlanta can't do anything right. The paperwork is a mess. I need a break." Her heels clicked through the room and stopped right in front of the wardrobe. I held my breath. 1 second. 2. The door trembled a little, but she only hung her coat on a hook and walked away. Her phone rang. "Yes," I told him. "If she keeps trying to prove she's competent, just show the records and that's that. Who believes an old woman anyway?" Ha ha. The door clicked shut. I stayed still, every muscle taut. When her steps finally receded, I dared to step out. The room was cold, empty, and dusty, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I saw only one thing clearly: the truth. I looked down at my phone, the screen lit with dozens of photos. Evidence. I gripped it and whispered, "You think I'm old and confused, but I was a nurse, and I know how to detect the pathology behind a fake smile." I stepped out of the room, moving as quietly as I could. The front door closed behind me with a soft click, but in my head, it sounded like a drum. By the time I drove off the coastal road, the sky had turned to rain. The first drop hit the windshield and smeared the light. I didn't feel weak anymore. Inside me, anger had become something else. Quiet, deep, and sharp as a scalpel. Tomorrow, I will find a lawyer, not to beg for justice, but to take it back. That night, I returned to the house like a shadow. The Charleston wind whipped against my collar, salt and seaweed clinging to my skin, sharpening every sense I had left. I turned off the engine a few houses from the gate, listening to my heartbeat thud steady, like the soft clinking of mooring chains. In my bag were a fully charged phone, my small notebook, and the old key that still smelled faintly of my husband's machine oil. The gate opened with a low click, the sound of memory knocking softly. The moss-covered stone path led me past the faded carving, H&R 1984. I placed the tip of my shoe on those letters, my throat tightening before I forced it down. I couldn't afford tenderness now. The front door yielded when the key turned. Darkness spilled out, thick, like water. I didn't switch on the lights, only used my phone flashlight, a narrow beam sweeping over dust and disarray. The living room was worse than before. New cardboard boxes, a printer still warm, envelopes torn open, wine stains on the oak table. The air was choked with cheap perfume and cigarette smoke. Smells that never belonged to this house. I slipped on thin gloves, moved a chair aside, and opened the stack of papers on the table. On top was the quitclaim deed, the transfer document. I tilted the light. Helen Johnson transfers full ownership to David Johnson. The signature, David, stood tall and deliberate, not the slight, left-leaning scrawl with a trailing tail I'd known since he first learned to write. I photographed every corner, time-stamped each image. My hands shook, but the lens couldn't. Below that was a file, stamped with the Charleston Health Associates logo. My name on the first page, diagnosis, early cognitive decline. The date was 3 weeks ago. Beneath it, the signature of a doctor named Robert Klein, a name I had never heard. I stood still. Their play was perfectly staged now. The confused mother, the voluntary deed. All it needed was David's debt to make the machine crush me flat. In the last drawer, a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside, blue ink, David's handwriting. Melissa, I talked to Mom, but she doesn't get it. $80,000 is due. If she doesn't sign, we lose everything. You were right. It's just paperwork. She'll never know. I didn't cry. The pain settled like wet sand, heavy, silent, staying put. I switched to video mode and slowly panned around the table. Papers, envelopes, the printer, a receipt for my sold jewelry. Each frame was a thread, all leading to the same knot. Then, the garage door screeched open. I killed the light and slipped into the closet. The dark smelled of old cedar and faint mint, the mothballs I'd left long ago. A stripe of hallway light spilled through the crack. Footsteps clicked, sharp as nails on my pulse. God, the Atlanta guys sent the wrong date again. Melissa's voice, clipped, agitated. You're playing with fire, said Veronica, sounding drained. Fire? Who believes an old woman with a dementia diagnosis? David's in debt. He'll keep quiet. Once the sale clears and the money's split, we're done. What about the old letterbox? Toss it. Or burn it. Memories don't pay bills. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, holding my breath. Their heels retreated. The door clicked shut. I counted to 30 before stepping out. The room sank back into a silence dense as lead. I found my way to the corner wardrobe. My wooden box was still there. Inside were my husband's letters after his first surgery. The ink smeared, but the words warm. Don't be afraid to be alone. The house will protect you. I held the box to my chest. My ribs burned, not from fear, but from something straightening inside me. A spine rediscovering itself. I tucked the box into my bag, turned back to the desk, and photographed the remaining bills and call logs on the landline. Several calls to Charleston Health Associates, the latest just 4 days ago. In the wall mirror, under the glow of my phone screen, I caught my own reflection. A woman I'd forgotten looked back. Not a mother, not an old lady, but a survivor. My old training came flooding back. Steady, observe, prioritize, exit. I set the camera to record a slow, 10-second sweep, then froze. The hinges down the hall creaked faintly. I stopped the video, left the room. Each stair I placed perfectly on the boards that didn't squeak. I remembered their sounds, like I remembered a patient's pulse under my fingers. At the bottom, I paused in the living room, straightened the wedding photo at the center of the table, and turned it outward. My husband's smile caught a sliver of moonlight. "I heard you, love," I whispered. "This time, I stand on my own." I closed the door behind me. Outside, the wind struck harder, the salt thick in the air. Passing the rose trellis, the wet leaves brushed my pant leg, leaving a cold trail like the sea's own seal. At the gate, I turned once. The house stood still, holding its breath. I understood. From this night on, it wasn't the place I was cast out of. It was the crime scene I was about to expose. In the car, my phone screen lit up. Dozens of sharp images, timestamps, GPS tags, 2 video scans. I checked them quickly, enough to weave the entire web. The forged deed, the fake medical report, the $80,000 letter, jewelry receipts, the still-warm printer. I uploaded copies to my cloud and to the USB I always carried. Every case needs a second exit route. That's what night shifts in the ER taught me. I sat still for a few seconds, listening to the wind swirl around the glass. My calm surprised me. The anger had become something else, a scalpel's edge, cold and exact, waiting for the right incision. I wrote in my notebook, "Contact elder law attorney. Verify Dr. Robert Klein and Charleston. Health Associates. Request handwriting analysis. Preserve digital evidence. Triple backup. Avoid confrontation. Proceed legally." Far off, the harbor lights blinked in even rhythm, like someone signaling, "Keep going." I started the car and rolled slowly down the road that ran along the water. On the surface of the sea, the moonlight shattered into 1,000 silver shards. I saw myself in them, broken, but reflecting stronger than the dark. At the last bend, memory struck. Little David running through the yard, holding up a seashell, eyes bright. "Mom, isn't this one pretty?" I laid that memory beside the present like 2 cards on a table. One was the child I raised, the other, the man who signed away his mother's refuge. Both were David, but only one would answer to the law. I murmured to the sea, "I once kept steady while blood still flowed. I'll stay steady while ink lies on paper." And as I turned onto the dark boulevard, I knew I'd crossed a line. From victim to plaintiff of fate itself. That night, I wasn't searching for comfort. I was collecting evidence. And now I had it. Clear, sharp, and heavy enough to unlock the doors of justice by morning. From the moment I left that coastal road, I knew. The game had changed hands. The storm was no longer out there. The storm was me. That morning, Charleston's sky was dreary, clouds so heavy it felt like they might pour over the whole ocean. I drove along the riverside street, my hands still trembling slightly on the wheel. Beside me, my husband's old wooden box lay still. I brought it not because it needed protection, but because I needed something to remind me I am not alone. Attorney Gallagher's office sat in an old South Carolina-style building. Red brick walls, frosted glass doors, a small brass plaque outside engraved with Thomas Gallagher, Elder Law and Civil Rights. When I pushed the door open, the hanging bell chimed softly. The smell of coffee and printer paper blended together, creating an air that was both serious and warm. A tall man around 60, half silver hair, looked up from his desk. His eyes were neither probing nor pitying, only attentive. "Mrs. Johnson?" I nodded. "Yes." "Evelyn said you could help me." He gestured for me to sit. "Just call me Thomas. Here we don't talk about failure, only about what needs to be done." His voice was steady and even, and it made me feel a little safer. Thomas set a cup of peppermint tea in front of me and said, Tell me everything. No need to organize it. I'll find the logic. And so I told him. Every shard, every small detail. The shattered seagull statue, the wedding photo face down on the floor, Melissa yelling in my face, the just sign the papers post online. The night I went back to the house, the forged documents, the medical file printed with my name, the doctor's signature I'd never seen, the letter David wrote to Melissa about the $80,000 debt, the watch my husband owned now worn on Veronica's wrist. I told him everything. I left nothing out. While I spoke, Thomas didn't interrupt, only furrowed his brow now and then, taking notes in neat, sharp strokes. When I finished, he tapped his pen lightly on the desk. "Helen," he said, "this isn't a family matter anymore. This is asset fraud and elder abuse, and I don't say that lightly." I looked at him without reacting. My head just felt empty. He opened a drawer, took out a folder, then spoke slowly as if laying bricks. "Here's my plan. 3 steps, no more. 1. We obtain the original medical records from Charleston Health Associates. I'll request a subpoena compelling them to produce the entire chart and appointment logs. If the doctor who signed never actually saw you, that's proof of fabrication. 2. We send David's signature for forensic analysis. If we can show the signature on the quitclaim deed doesn't match, that deed is void. 3. I'll file an emergency petition with the county court for a temporary restraining order to preserve the asset. It will freeze any transaction involving the house, including sale or encumbrance. They won't have time to move anything." He paused, looking me straight in the eye. "But the condition is that you go the distance with me. No panicking, no backing out midway, no matter what they say or who they send to persuade you. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat tight. "What about the cost?" I asked. Thomas leaned back, fingers interlaced. "I don't take fees up front, but legal costs, expert fees, and court filings are real. If we want speed and certainty, we need a retainer fund of at least $25,000 to $30,000. And if you can, prepare more. I'm guessing you have some savings." I smiled faintly. $110,000, a lifetime of nursing." He was quiet for a moment, respect flickering in his eyes. "You know, very few people are willing to use their last savings to fight for the truth. But if you decide to, I'll make sure every dollar is transparent, receipted, and reported. You're not gambling. You're investing in justice." I gave a dry, small laugh. "Justice? That sounds extravagant, Mr. Gallagher." "It doesn't," he replied. "It's only expensive when we don't demand it." I stayed silent. After a moment, I said, "I'll do it." Thomas only nodded. No thanks, no pep talk. Just the nod of someone who understood this decision weighed more than money. He prepared the paperwork and set up the trust account. "Tomorrow morning, go to the bank, withdraw the funds, and deposit them here. I'll initiate the first steps immediately. All communications, including with your son, go through me. You won't confront anyone directly. Let the law speak for you." Before I left, he made a call. "I need verification on Dr. Robert Klein. Send an urgent request to Charleston Health Associates. I need the detailed appointment history for patient Helen Johnson for the past month." He hung up and looked at me. "I won't promise easy, but I promise accurate." I drove out of the office with a strange lightness, my heart beating in a new rhythm. At the bank, I stood at the counter to withdraw the money. The teller asked, "All of it, ma'am?" "Yes," I said. "All of it." Each bill counted out felt like a fragment of memory. My first night shift at 25. Simple dinners of soup and bread. My husband's laughter when we finished the first wall of the old house. I signed the transfer slip, my hand shaking but my eyes steady. $110,000. No longer savings, ammunition. The breath for a battle I never thought I'd have to fight. On the way back, sea wind blew through the window, the salt stinging my lips. I stopped by the seawall and watched sunlight spread over the water. Thomas had said, "When we do this, David will face serious legal consequences. Are you ready?" I thought of David, the child who once held my hand over the wooden bridge, afraid the waves were too strong. I remembered his voice, his eyes when he was small. But then, I saw the letter he wrote to Melissa, the cold, practical strokes of his pen. Ready? No one is ready to pull their child back from a cliff, especially when he walked there himself. But if I don't, I'll be stamped as incompetent forever, and someone else will retell my story with a laugh. I returned to the inn. Night had fallen. Margaret opened the door, looked at me, and asked nothing. She only said, "Tea's hot, Helen." I thanked her, sat down, and opened the wooden box. My husband's letters still rested inside. One had a short line, the ink already blurred. "If the day comes when you must fight, remember, I always believed you were stronger than anyone." I folded the letter gently, warmth spreading in my chest. That night, I wrote in my notebook every task to do. Subpoena the clinic's records. Forensic analysis of David's signature. Petition the court for an asset freeze order. List items at risk of being sold: the watch, wooden furniture, jewelry. Notify the Agency for Protection of the Elderly. I paused at the last line and added 2 words: not afraid. When I closed the notebook, my phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. 8:30 a.m. tomorrow, emergency filing. I'll pick you up. I replied, ready. I sat by the window, watching pale moonlight spill over the sea. In that light, I saw my own reflection. Not an old woman stripped of everything, but a woman reclaiming her life, page by page, figure by figure, line by line. Tomorrow, when I walk into court, I won't bring tears. I'll bring evidence, dignity, and $110,000. Everything that remains of my life, wrapped in 2 words: justice. And I know, once I begin, I will not stop. That morning, Charleston was veiled in a cold gray light, like a mist left behind after the night's rain. I put on a gray vest, clasped the thin silver necklace I still had, and tightened it slightly to steady my hands. In the mirror, I saw a 70-year-old woman with deep lines etched across her face, but fear no longer in her eyes. When Thomas arrived at the inn's porch, he simply said, "Today, let the law speak for you." I nodded. There are days when saying less carries more weight. The road back to Sea Glass Drive was so familiar it ached, but today was different. In front of my house were 2 police cars, a court SUV, and Thomas's car. Red and blue lights reflected off the window panes, flashing in a steady rhythm like a heart newly resuscitated. The sea breeze swept through, carrying a salty tang and the scent of damp wood. A court officer stepped out, raised a handheld speaker, and announced clearly, "By order of the Charleston County Court, the property at 17 Sea Glass Drive is temporarily sealed to facilitate an investigation into forgery and the misappropriation of an elderly person's assets. All individuals inside are required to cooperate." I didn't blink. The reading of the order bounced off the wooden porch steps like taps waking the house from a stupor. The door flew open. Melissa lunged out, hair disheveled, eyes red, a gaudy stained nightgown clinging to her. "Who do you think you are? This is my house." Thomas presented the order, his voice calm. "No, ma'am. This is an active scene under investigation by court order, based on evidence of falsified medical reports, unlawful transfer, and asset seizure." She gave a derisive laugh. "A 70-year-old woman thinks she can beat me?" Thomas replied evenly. "South Carolina law does not privilege bloodline. It privileges lawful ownership and truth. I was permitted to enter to identify personal property." I crossed the threshold as if stepping through an old wound. The air reeked of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke, mingled with cold food. A thin film of dust clung to the oak tabletop. The printer on the desk was still warm. Beside it, half-opened envelopes and half-printed pages, exposing ragged edges of words. I passed the glass cabinet. The seagull figurines my husband once sculpted were now chipped beaks and broken wings. The old glaze freckled with dried wine stains. "Don't touch that!" Melissa shrieked. A police officer blocked her. "By court order, she has the right to identify her personal property. Please cooperate." In the corner by the TV stand, I saw my husband's watch. A worn leather strap, scratched crystal, hands still inching forward. I lifted it with both hands, feeling my chest ease. "Darling, I found you." The officer nodded. "We'll seal this as evidence of personal property." I nodded, as if reclaiming a fragment of my soul. In the hallway, they inventoried receipts for the sale of my jewelry, transfer yanked, logs, call records to the clinic, everything into evidence bags, the scratch of pens sounding like a loose rope being cinched tight. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Veronica came down, clutching a bag, face pale. An officer approached. "Veronica Carter, you are under temporary arrest on suspicion of complicity in forgery and theft." She burst into tears. "I only did what my sister—" Thomas didn't turn. "The law doesn't care who told you to do it. The law cares who did it." The cuffs clicked. Small, decisive. Outside, Melissa kept thrashing. "She's senile. There's a doctor's record." Thomas answered, voice cold as a scalpel. "The Robert Klein report is invalid. Charleston Health Associates confirms they did not examine Mrs. Helen. The signature is a sham, cash paid from David Johnson's account. Do you have anything you wish to add?" For the first time, I saw her speechless. Her eyes darted for a handhold, but there was only evidence tape and court personnel all around. The garage door opened. David walked in, rumpled shirt, dark circles, stopping short at the sight of the police and me. Thomas stepped forward. "Are you David Johnson? We have evidence of unlawful transfer based on forged records. You have the right to remain silent. If you wish to cooperate, now is the time." David looked at me, his voice breaking. "Mom, I just wanted to take care of the debt. Melissa said it was temporary." I looked straight at him. "You didn't just sign papers, David. You signed away your mother's trust and sold it for $80,000. Melissa screamed, "Don't listen to her!" But David no longer looked at her. His shoulders sagged like a roof soaked by rain. I wanted to hold my son, but I knew if I softened now, everything would slip from my grasp again. The inventory team went through every room. The list emerged. The watch, carved wood pieces, jewelry, documents. Thomas signed the report and handed it back to the officer. He murmured to me, "The TRO is in effect. From now on, no one can remove anything from this house, and no transactions concerning this property can be made without a court order." I exhaled, feeling the storm shift a few nautical miles offshore. In the kitchen, I saw the wedding photo set askew. I straightened it, my palm against the cold glass. In the reflection, I saw two people, us, who once believed that work and decency were enough. "Do you see?" I whispered. I finally stood up. Outside, a car door shut with a clack. Veronica was led away. Melissa shot me a look sharp as a blade. "You'll never be happy, old woman. Go ahead and win. You'll only end up alone." I didn't answer. Loneliness is not as frightening as being stripped and lied about. I once stood in the ICU counting fragile heartbeats. I know how much I can endure. Thomas signaled, "Give her a final pass to confirm items before sealing." I made one round, letting my eyes rest on every piece tied to my life. The wall he painted, the armchair he carved, the dining table where I once counted out pills for the neighbors. I took a few photos, not for the court, but for my heart. At the porch, I paused. In my coat pocket was the original key, the thing I'd clenched through all my wandering days. In front of everyone, I slid it into the lock and turned gently. Click. The sound of metal meeting metal. Dry, clean, echoing farther than I expected. Thomas smiled. The sound of true ownership. I nodded. And the sound of a woman reclaiming herself. David stood at the edge of the yard, eyes rimmed red. I spoke softly, without reproach. "Go. When you have the courage to tell the truth, I will listen. But from now on, this house is not a place for anyone to hide." He bowed his head like a man hearing a verdict. The officers taped the seals, recorded the time, signed their names. The sea wind blew salt across our clothes, exposing every scratch, every stain, and the slender lifeline I had just pulled back toward myself. Thomas said quietly, "You're not finished, but today you've reclaimed the right to breathe in your own home." I smiled, weary yet steady. I don't need their apologies. I need the truth, rewritten in black and white. He nodded. And that's exactly what we're doing. I looked at the calm blue of Charleston Sea, listening to gulls cleave the wind. No more blaring music, no stink of liquor and cheap perfume. Only wind, light, and a heartbeat returning to normal. I knew the legal road ahead would be long. Signature forensics, confronting the clinic, testimony, hearings. But today, the storm had left me. It was curling on the far side, where those who thought the elderly were voiceless and invisible would meet the law. I ran my hand along the wooden railing he once planed smooth, the old scent of resin returning. "Home," I whispered. "From now on, I won't let anyone speak for us." The climbing roses rustled as if in reply. I turned to Thomas. "Let's go. There's still much to do." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Plaintiff." I stepped down from the porch, leaving behind the ceiling tape's sound like a full stop. On the thinly sunlit road, I was no longer someone driven out. I was someone standing tall, letting justice speak, and letting my house, after many years, breathe as itself. After that day, my house fell into a strange kind of quiet. No more loud music, no more cheap perfume, only the wind threading through the porch and the thin cries of seagulls circling far above. I sat in my husband's old armchair, looking out the window. The morning light spread gold across the wooden floor, right where the footprints of those who had been driven out once marked the boards. Now the house was clean, clean to the point of emptiness. Thomas told me the police had finished sealing the property. Veronica had been charged with theft and complicity. Melissa now faced charges of forgery, an elder exploitation. But David's case was more complicated. He's cooperating, Thomas said. But the outcome will depend on how deep he was involved. He might avoid prosecution, but he'll have to face the consequences. I nodded, saying nothing. Consequences? Sometimes they don't come from courtrooms, only from time. That afternoon, David appeared. No call, no knock. I heard the car stop at the gate, the soft scrape of his shoes on the stone path. When he stood at the porch, I knew I was ready. And still, my heart clenched like an old wound reopening. He wore a faded shirt, his face drawn, eyes downcast. "Mom," he said softly. "Come in," I replied, calm. "Don't stand in the wind." We sat in the kitchen, the same place where I had cooked for him for decades. I made him a cup of tea, not out of desire, but out of habit. A mother's reflex, even when the heart beneath it is in pieces. "I don't know where to start," he murmured. "Start with the truth," I said. "How much do you owe me? And why did you do it?" He looked down at the table. 80,000. Not gambling, like people said. I invested. Stupidly, greedily. I thought I could pay it back fast, but I lost everything. Melissa. She said she could fix it, that all she needed was your signature. I believed her. I thought it was temporary, that you wouldn't be affected. But by the time I realized I'd sold the house, it was too late. I stayed silent. The tea cooled between us. I looked out the window, at the climbing roses struggling to bloom again after being neglected for so long. "Do you know what your father and I did to have this house?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "You've told me before, but—" "No," I interrupted. You don't remember. You don't remember the nights I worked double shifts and came home to find your father still nailing shutters in the cold wind. You don't remember each plank he hammered by hand, each nail he drove into the wall while his fingers still trembled after surgery. This house isn't an asset, David. It's my life. He lowered his head, tears falling onto his hands. "I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment. In the dim light, I saw the child he once was, the boy who brought me seashells and asked, "Isn't this one pretty, Mom?" Now, the man before me was that same child, only this time he was bringing me fragments instead of shells. "Sorry is easy," I said softly. "But do you know, some wounds don't need stitching, because even when they heal, they still leave scars." His voice trembled. "Melissa, she said you hated me, that you'd never forgive me. I was weak, Mom. I was scared of losing everything. So I chose wrong." I looked at him, saw the shame burning in his eyes. "You're not weak, David. You just never learned how to take responsibility. I sheltered you too long." Silence stretched between us. The wind pressed against the window, hissing like the house itself was sighing. "She'll go to prison, won't she?" he asked quietly. "The court will decide," I said. "But do you know what's heavier than prison?" He lifted his head, waiting. "It's having to live every day with what you've done." He broke down. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to see you, to say I know I was wrong. I've lost everything. My job, my money, her, my reputation. All I have left is you." I shook my head gently. "No, David. You lost me the day you signed those papers." He looked at me, silent. Tears streaked down his cheeks. I wanted to hold him, to cradle him like when he was small, but my hands stayed flat on the table, unmoving, because I knew that if I reached for him now, every ounce of justice I had fought for would collapse. "I'm leaving Charleston," he said at last. "I need to start over somewhere. But, Mom, If one day I come back, will you? Don't ask that, I interrupted. Forgiveness isn't something you request, it's something you earn. When you understand that, I'll know. He nodded and stood. I didn't walk him to the door. When it closed, the click echoed through the house. Dry, sharp, final. The same sound I'd heard when I turned my key in the lock that day. Maybe a period, maybe a comma. I couldn't tell. That night, Thomas called. Everything's moving in the right direction. The police found emails from Melissa threatening the doctor. Are you all right? I'm all right, I said. Just empty. Emptiness is normal after you stand back up, Helen, he said gently. But empty doesn't mean weak. I smiled faintly. I know. It's just strange. I never thought I'd have to be strong because of my own son. After I hung up, I went out to the garden. The moon hung low over the water, its silver light washing over the climbing roses I had just trimmed. Amid the dead branches, a new bud was forming. I touched it gently, felt a thorn prick my fingertip. Pain, but real. That sting reminded me I was still alive. I sat on the stone bench where my husband once read the newspaper and closed my eyes. In the dark, I heard the waves, the winds whisper, and something small within me. The faint sound of trust being reborn, fragile but present. I whispered to myself, love doesn't die from betrayal. It only changes shape, becomes quieter, steadier. And sometimes, loving someone means letting them face what they've done. I lifted my head. The moonlight fell through the branches, glinting off my silver hair. For the first time, I felt light. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had accepted it. Because betrayal, as Thomas once said, is the strangest thing. It kills you and teaches you how to live. The first morning, without the blare of music, I woke to the sound of seagulls. Early light slipped through the curtains, laying a golden streak across the clean sheets. The crash of waves in the distance beat as steadily as the tick-tock of the old clock on the shelf, the heartbeat of a house that had just caught its breath again. I put on a wool cardigan and walked barefoot down the hallway. The wooden floor still crunched with dust, and the smell of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke still hid in the seams of the walls. I stood in the living room, took up a bucket of warm water mixed with vinegar, pulled on rubber gloves, and started with the small stains. When the water turned cloudy, I changed it. When it ran clear, I scrubbed on. The tang of vinegar rose cool and clean, and I felt my chest lighten as if a latch had been undone. I pulled my husband's armchair back to its proper place by the window and laid a hand-woven throw over the back. When my palm passed over the grain he had once planed, I felt my whole body click back into place, as if an inner bone had just been set into its groove. In the kitchen, I flung the window wide, tossed out the dried spices, resharpened the old knife, hauled out the mildewed cast-iron pan to soak, scrubbed it, dried it over the flame, then oiled it. The black sheen grew back like new skin. The pan tapped the grate with a light ting, a small sound enough to make me smile. On the table, I gathered the shards of the seagull figurine, the wedding photo with its chipped glass, the cracked cup. I cleaned them and set them all on a wooden tray. The fissures didn't disappear, but they were clean. Like me, not fully healed, yet able to go on. By noon, I dripped oil into the hinges, open, close, until the creak softened into breath. I replaced a loose outlet, tightened the ceiling lamp cover, flipped the switch. A gentle amber poured down, warming the walls as if someone had just come home. The phone rang. Thomas. Good news, he said. Veronica's been charged with theft. Dr. Klein's been suspended, and the medical board has opened an investigation into falsified signatures. Melissa and David are now with the prosecutor, and the anti-dissipation order is still in force. I don't need them in prison, I sighed. I just need them unable to do this to anyone else. Do you want a cleaning crew? No. I need to do it with my own hands. He paused a beat, his voice softening. Then take care of yourself, Helen. I am, I said. In the afternoon, I went out to the porch. The stone path had been heaved by roots, like a stumble mid-sentence. I lifted each stone, pried out the roots, spread sand, set the stones back, and tapped them level with a rubber mallet. Sweat salted my lips. My palms burned, but my rhythm grew steadier. Some kinds of fatigue drag you down. Others lift you up. Today was the second kind. I painted the front door Charleston, green, so dark it's nearly black, green only when the sun strikes it. I taped the edges, rolled the paint slowly. Wherever the brush went, the oldness receded. When I stepped back, I saw my face reflected in the drying door, older but upright. That evening I climbed to the attic. The smell of old wood and dry dust was like an archive of memory. I pulled out a fabric box, the hand-stitched quilt I'd left half-finished, tiny florals, stripes, polka dots, scraps of older seasons. I spread it on the table and threaded a needle. The first stitch wavered, the next grew firmer. By the 10th stitch, my hands remembered. The lamplight pooled on the thread like honey. I was sewing the torn parts of myself. On the second day, I went into the garden. The sea wind was dry and biting, the soil salty. Most of the climbing roses had died back, but amid the gray canes was one plump green shoot. I cut away the dead wood, loosened the soil, mixed in compost, and watered slowly. The damp smell rose, the scent of beginnings. I laid my hand on the rough wooden trellis and whispered, Love, it hasn't abandoned us. Evelyn stopped by with a basket of bread. Tell me what you need. I need time and a few nails. I laughed. She eyed the green door and the leveled path, nodding. One thing at a time, huh? One breath at a time, I said. In the days that followed, I lived by that rhythm. Shake out the curtains, wash the sheets, vacuum, scrub the doorknobs, replace pillow inserts, polish the panes. I printed Thomas's emails and sorted them into plastic sleeves. TRO, Klein, quitclaim, invoices, filed into a felt-lined safe. I taped a slip of paper inside the cupboard door, written with a fountain pen. Home is where we keep our word to ourselves. When I reached the printing room, the room where they'd staged the fake paperwork, I threw the windows open, lifted each drawer out to the porch, wiped them clean, and let sunlight run straight into the grain. I set my old desk back in place and put a glass jar with a few green sprigs on it. Nothing showy, just a small, audible pulse of life. On the 5th morning, the first rose unfurled, petals pale as an eyelid. I crouched by the trellis, fingertips pressed into the warm earth. A line of thorn lightly scored my skin, pain just enough to know I could still feel, and therefore live. That afternoon, Thomas came by. He stood on the porch, taking in the newly painted door and gleaming floor, and smiled. You've done what a court record can't, given the house its soul back. I only tended what deserved tending, I said. He handed me a paper. The asset protection orders extended until trial. Klein's file has been referred for criminal investigation. I also filed you for the Elder Abuse Victim Assistance Program. I'm all right, I said. But thank you. I hope the next person will feel less alone. After he left, I set my husband's watch, newly returned, on the old shelf. I wiped the glass, gently pulled the crown. The hands ticked forward one notch, then kept a steady pace. Time in the house meshed, snug as lock and key. I laid a new welcome mat at the door, not to invite anyone in, but to welcome myself home. I wasn't in a hurry to forgive. I wasn't waiting for an apology either. Healing, I've learned, isn't forgetting. Healing is daring to touch the wound without flinching. At night, I carried a chair onto the porch and poured hot tea. The sea was black silk studded with silver. I opened the wooden letterbox and took out one of his notes. When you're afraid, touch the wall. It's still there, like me. I set my palm on the freshly painted wall. Cool, smooth, trustworthy. Tears fell, light as mist, not despair, the recognition that I was standing. By the 7th day, the living room was clean. The wooden floor shone like a wet seashell. White curtains lifted on the breeze. The deep green door closed softly. In the kitchen, the cast iron pan, black and bright, waited for flame. On the porch, the rose opened one more petal. The phone buzzed. Thomas. The court set the preliminary hearing. Keep your pace, Helen. How are you? I'm all right, I said. I'm listening to the house breathe. He chuckled. Hold on to that sound. I slid the original key into the lock and heard the click, a period at the end of a long sentence. On the leveled stone path, my shadow stretched long, but no longer wavered. I passed the rose trellis. A thorn traced another fine line across my fingertip. Pain just enough to remember I'm alive. Tonight, I'll cook a simple soup, spread the half-finished quilt, and turn the radio down low. I'll sit in his chair and look out at the sea. When the wind carries salt to my lips, I'll say, just loud enough for the house to hear. I lost a part of myself, but I saved myself. This house saved me from collapse. And now it's coming back to life, brick by brick, breath by breath. That morning in Charleston, something felt different. It wasn't just the sunlight. It was the lightness in my chest, as if an invisible burden had finally dissolved. The sea was still out there, the waves still steady, but today they sounded like a blessing rather than the lament of months spent in betrayal. I brewed a pot of black tea and carefully poured it into the porcelain cup my husband used every morning. The scent of tea mingled with the roses in the garden, and the house began to breathe with life again. I had lived in silence long enough to understand. There are things you cannot get back. You can only learn to go on without them. I no longer hoped for a miracle from the court or from those who had hurt me. I waited for only one thing: closure, quiet, and without bitterness. The phone rang. I recognized Thomas's voice at once, calm and composed as always. "Congratulations, Helen," he said. "The hearing is over. The judge has issued a final ruling. Your ownership of the house is fully restored. All forged evidence has been nullified, and the forgery case has been escalated to criminal court. Melissa is under house arrest. David, because he cooperated with the investigation, won't be prosecuted, but he must return all the proceeds he received." I sat silent for a moment, letting each word drift by slowly. I don't want them destroyed, Thomas. I only want justice to be called by its right name. I know. And you've done what very few can. You stood up to your own family without letting hatred swallow you. I smiled faintly. I don't hate them anymore. Hate only dirties the heart. But forget, I won't forget either. After Thomas hung up, I sat looking at the teacup on the table. Steam rose from it, thin as a thread. I thought of David, the little boy who once held my hand as he ran around the yard, who gave me a tiny seashell and said, "Mom, I'll build a house by the sea so you'll never be sad." The house still stood, but between us, there lay another ocean, the ocean of lies and silence. I was about to wash the cup when I heard a knock. 3 taps, light and hesitant. I stepped onto the porch, and there stood Melissa. It took me a few seconds to recognize her. No heavy makeup, no designer dress, none of that overdone confidence. She wore an old gray coat. Her hair was messy, her eyes swollen. Her hands trembled around a small bag. "Could you give me a few minutes?" she asked hoarsely. I nodded and opened the door. "Come in." She stood in the living room, the very room where, months earlier, she had screamed, "Why is this old woman still here?" Now, in that same place, she bowed her head. The smell of fresh paint and tea and roses all mingled together, and the quiet grew heavy. I know nothing I say today can erase what happened," Melissa began. "But I can't keep living with it inside me." She opened the bag and took out my husband's silver watch. The morning light struck the metal and flashed a cold, honest gleam. "I want to return it," she said, voice breaking. "I don't deserve to keep anything that belongs to you. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." I looked at her and said nothing. She went on, tears beginning to fall. "I lost my job, my friends pulled away, people call me a fraud. But what haunts me most is the look in your eyes that day. Not angry, just sad. I can't sleep because of it. I thought I was strong, that I was helping David, but I was wrong. I did it all out of ambition, out of fear of being poor. And in the process, I destroyed a woman who only wanted peace in her own home." I sighed. "You're right about one thing. You can't erase it. But you can make something useful out of the wreckage. Forgiveness isn't handed out for tears, Melissa. It has to be earned with actions." She looked up, eyes red. "If you truly regret it, tell your story. Tell other women what can happen when they trust the wrong person. Let your mistake become a lesson, not a wound. That is the only way to atone." Melissa nodded, tears streaming. "I will. I promise." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "David, he doesn't dare see you. He says he can't look his mother in the eye. But if you allow it, I'll tell him that. Maybe one day, you might be willing to hear him." I looked out at the changing light. "If he wants to speak, let him come as a man, not as a frightened child. I will listen, but I won't promise forgiveness." She nodded, whispered, "Thank you," and left. The door closed as softly as a breath. I stood there, neither angry nor relieved, only a sense of emptiness, but an emptiness that had been cleansed. In the afternoon, I drove to Thomas's office. Charleston's waters were clear and blue, white sails skimming the distance. I sat in his room, sunlight pouring across the wooden desk. "Are you sure?" he asked again as he set the new will before me. "I'm sure," I said. "This house cannot just be a place to live. It has to go on protecting others, the way it protected me." Thomas looked at me, his eyes briefly bright. "You know, Helen, few people end a legal battle with kindness. You've given justice a soul." I smiled and signed. "I used to be a nurse, Thomas. I'm used to stitching wounds. Maybe this is just the final stitch. For myself." On the way home, the sea wind lifted my silver hair. I remembered everything. The days my husband and I built this house, the hammering, the laughter, dinners on the porch, the smell of fresh paint, a child's voice calling, "Mom!" It all unspooled like a slow film. In the end, perhaps what remains isn't betrayal, but the will to survive. That evening, I sat on the porch, where the salty wind eddied and the roses released their scent. I turned on the little radio and played the old jazz tune, Blue in Green. The saxophone was slow, soft as breath. I whispered to myself, "You see, my love, I did it. Not with hatred, but with resolve. I kept my promise to you. The house still stands, and it still protects me." A breeze stirred and fluttered the curtain. The wedding photo on the wall shimmered in the moonlight, his face still smiling. I opened my phone and saw a new email from Thomas, the digital copy of the will. At the end of the page, a line read, "House at 17 Seaglass Drive to be transferred to the Charleston Women's Trust, to serve as a shelter and provide legal support for elderly women who have suffered financial fraud." I read it again, then signed electronically. The blue ink of my signature quivered, but held. When I pressed send, it felt like placing a period at the end of a whole chapter of my life. Before bed, I wrote in my journal, "Forgiveness is not a gift for others, but a key that unlocks your own heart. But forgiveness needs limits, so that kindness isn't exploited and peace doesn't become weakness." I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Moonlight poured through the window, spilling silver across the floor. I stepped onto the porch and breathed in the salt and the roses. On the wall, the line I once wrote remained, "Home is where we keep our word to ourselves." I laid my hand on that wall and said softly, "My love, I kept my word." A light breeze passed through my hair. I don't know if it was chance or if he was listening, but I felt something warm. I went back inside and locked the door. The click sounded neat and certain, just enough to tell me justice was complete. But more important, my heart was truly free. I don't need their apologies, and I don't need the past to change. I only need to know that from now on, no one can trespass on this house, and no one can make me smaller in my own life. I turned out the lights, leaving the house awash in moonlight. Outside, the sea kept singing. And in the waves, I seemed to hear his voice. "You did it, Helen. At last, you've become yourself again." 6 months had passed since the day I signed the new will. Charleston was deep into summer now. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and the sound of gentle waves, like a whispered blessing. I lived quietly in my house, alone but never lonely. Every morning, I brewed tea, watered the climbing roses on the porch, and watched sunlight spill across the bricks I had laid myself. The house had become an old friend, weathered but warm and loyal. People often asked if I regretted anything after all that had happened. I only smiled. I did not. Because if I hadn't walked through the darkest days, I would never have learned that I still had the strength to rise. I had once been the gentle wife, the devoted mother, the woman who always yielded. But life had taught me that kindness cannot be a door forever left open. It needs a lock. And I had finally learned how to keep the key. That morning, as I trimmed the roses, the mailman stopped by. A thick envelope, familiar handwriting. "David." I froze, my hand suspended midair. The wind carried salt and rose petals across the yard. I held the envelope for a moment before stepping inside. I sat by the window where the light touched the wooden table and carefully opened it. My hand trembled slightly. The first line read, "Mom, I don't know if you'll read this letter, but I have to write it because this is the only way I can look you in the eye, even if only through words." I set down my teacup and kept reading. "I've lost almost everything. The house, the money, my job, and Melissa. But the greatest loss is you. Not because you left me, but because I left you first. I remember when you worked night shifts at the hospital, but still woke early to make me breakfast. I remember your soft humming in the kitchen. I once thought I could repay you by earning more, by giving you an easier life. But I let greed and weakness blind me. I know you may never forgive me, and I don't dare ask for it. I just want you to know that every day I live with this shame. And maybe that's the fairest sentence I deserve." I paused, exhaling softly. In his words, I could still hear the echo of the barefoot boy who once ran across the sand, kite string in hand. I read on. "I heard you've given the house to the Charleston Women's Trust. That sounds like you, turning pain into something good. Mom, I'm starting over. I work at a small harbor now. Each morning, I help load fish, clean the boats, and watch the sunrise. And every time the sun rises, I think of you. I don't deserve to call you Mom anymore, but I still hope that one day you'll think of me, not with disappointment, but maybe with a little pity, or if I'm lucky, a little peace." I folded the letter slowly. My old hands trembled, but my heart was still, as calm as the sea at dawn. I didn't know whether to cry or smile. The letter carried no hope, only truth. Raw, painful, but true. I walked to the fireplace. The small fire flickered, casting an amber glow on the wedding photo above the mantel. I looked at him, the man who had built this home with calloused hands and steady love. Softly I said, "My dear, our son has finally learned how to face himself." I laid the letter on the flame. The paper curled and burned slowly, its light flickering in my eyes. There was no anger, no sorrow, only release. I didn't need to hold on anymore because I was no longer held captive by what had been. Outside, the rose trellis trembled in the breeze. The sky was shifting from blue to pale orange. I sat on the old chair, tea now cold in my hands. Inside me, there was a hollow, but not an empty one. It was the hollow that peace leaves behind. I remembered the letter's final lines. "I know you probably won't write back, but if one morning you walk past the harbor and see a gray-haired man watching the sunrise, that might be me. You don't have to stop. Just know that I'm still here and that I finally understand." I smiled. Not the smile of victory, but the quiet smile of someone who has finally seen her life's whole picture. As the sun rose above the horizon, its light spilled across the sea, glinting on the window glass. I stepped down the porch, took off my slippers, and felt the cool earth beneath my feet. Every brick, every coat of paint, every rose bush I had tended whispered the same truth. I survived. I looked up into the sunlight. It was so bright my eyes watered. I couldn't tell if it was from the glare or because my heart was too full. I spoke softly, to myself, to the house, to everything that had been. I've spent my life healing others' wounds. I never knew I'd have to learn how to heal my own, but I did. And now, I'm free. I turned back and locked the door. The click sounded clean and sure. I took a deep breath. The ocean shimmered under the newborn light, and the lighthouse stood steadfast in the distance. Calm, unwavering, like me. Before stepping down the last stair, I looked around the house one more time. Everything was still there. The silver watch, the wedding photo, the wall where I had written, "Home is where we keep our word to ourselves." I smiled. They once called me a greedy old woman. I whispered, "But I know the truth. I am the root, and roots don't fear storms." I walked along the stone path, the golden morning light stretching beneath my feet. The sea wind curled around me like an old embrace. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alive and utterly light. Dawn had come, not just outside, but within me. When the first sunlight spilled across the porch, I understood. Every storm exists for a reason. Some people call my story revenge, but I don't see it that way. I simply reclaimed what was always mine, not through anger, but through resolve and self-respect. Revenge isn't always about striking back. Sometimes it's about living better than they ever believed you could. That's the path I chose. To take revenge through peace, through light, through rising again without needing anyone's apology. Now, the house still stands, the roses bloom once more, and I, the woman once thought fragile, have finally learned to protect myself with love and grace. And you? If someone hurts you one day, will you fight back? Or will you live so well that they can only watch in silence? Share your thoughts in the comments, because perhaps your story could become the rebirth of another soul.